Hello everyone. Today I will be talking about the international politics of climate change. We all know what are the impacts of climate change in our day-to-day life because we all are experiencing it. Climate change has emerged as one of the important issues in international politics since 1970s. Many IPCC reports have already been published with regard to how our climate is changing, and we are experiencing the high sea level rise, melting of the glaciers, erratic rain patterns, droughts, floods as the frequent impacts of climate change. In international politics, there are difference of opinion regarding whether climate change is a reality or a myth. But still, the scientific evidence that are being published by IPCC clearly point towards the fact that climate change is a reality today. If environmental issues were primarily the issues of concerns within the domestic politics of countries earlier, now these issues are no more national in nature, but they have become truly international. Because these are the issues. When we talk about environment, when we talk about climate change, these issues are beyond the purview of nation states. Each and every state has to cooperate with one another in order to address this global challenge. But to what extent we are in a position to cooperate with each other? How many international agreements have been framed so far in order to combat this climate crisis? How we have to take up the climate crisis in a post-COVID world? These are some of the important challenges that we are addressing today. When we talk about climate change, one of the things that you have to keep in mind that climate change is a non-traditional security threat. When we talk about international politics, we know that there are traditional security challenges and non-traditional security challenges. When we talk about traditional security challenges, for example, armed conflict, war, all these figure within the traditional security challenges. But when we talk about the environmental issues, especially the climate change issue, that is a non-traditional security challenge. Still, we don't have sufficient mechanisms in place in order to address many of these non-traditional security challenges. When we talk about climate change, it is important that we have to trace the very history of the evolution of climate change politics. It was with the publication of Rachel Carlson's The Silent Spring. For the very first time, an awareness about environmental issues actually started to came to the notice in the public domain in the United States. And in the West, the climate change issue, the environmental issues began to get more attention and people started to talk about it. It was in 1972, for the very first time, actually the developed nations and the developing nations came together in order to address the environmental challenges that they have got. When we talk about the environmental issues, we know that since developed countries were experiencing with the very process of industrialization, they were consuming more. Definitely, because of that itself, they have more role in polluting the atmosphere. So in the 1972 Stockholm Conference, even there was a debate between the developed countries and developing countries regarding who is more responsible for polluting the atmosphere and thereby harming the earth. There was also a debate about developmental issues as well. Developing countries pointed out that many of the developing countries are trying to develop themselves. They are trying to attain the economic growth. Therefore, it is almost impossible for them to regulate their emissions at that particular point of time. So they were requesting the developed countries to reduce their emissions. But this conference, there was no consensus in the conference regarding who would be cutting their emissions. whether it should be the developed countries themselves or should the developing countries also reduce their emissions. But anyway, there was a consensus regarding it is important that we have to have sustainable development. It is important that we have to keep the environment along with our efforts to attain the economic growth. In 1985, ozone hole was identified. In 1988, there was drastic drought in the United States. These international developments also had played its role in convening many other international conferences in terms of addressing environmental issues, particularly the climate change issue. For the next important conference was held in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro, which we also call the Rio Summit or the Earth Summit. In the 1992 Earth Summit, in the Rio Summit, developed countries and developing countries decided that the environmental issues are getting worse, especially the climate change issue has already emerged as an important issue. It is important for the state to have collective action in order to address the climate change challenge. So decided that it is important to give form to an international agreement wherein all countries participate to address the climate change challenge. 1992 Rio Earth Conference, it was a beginning point in terms of giving form to the Conference of Parties. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they came up with an environmental treaty. Following that environmental treaty in 1997, as part of the Kyoto Conference, it was decided among the developed countries and developing countries to give form to the Kyoto Protocol. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol was one of the important international agreement that was signed by majority of the countries in order to combat the climate challenge. 1997 Kyoto Protocol was based on two important principles. One was the common but differentiated responsibility principle, and the other was respective capability principle. What we mean by common but differentiated responsibility principle? Common but differentiated responsibility principle means that all countries are responsible for polluting this atmosphere. Therefore, all countries share the responsibility, but some countries are more responsible than other countries in polluting the atmosphere, mainly the developed countries. If we look at the emission level, this is very clear. Developed countries have the historical responsibility to combat climate change. Why I am saying that developed countries have the historical responsibility to combat climate change? Because if we look at the emissions, if we look at the carbon emissions so far, if I roughly give you the statistics from 1751 to 2017, 25% of the total emissions are from United States of America. China has contributed 12.7%. On the other hand, India's contribution is just 3%. So the developed countries, especially the United States, stands ahead of all other developing countries in terms of the historical emissions. So definitely developed countries have the historical responsibility to combat climate change. So common but differentiated responsibility principle simply says that developed countries have more responsibility in addressing this challenge compared to developing countries and small island states. On the other hand, a respective capability principle was also given form. Respective capability principle means that the countries' capabilities are different. Each and every country is different in terms of their capacity or capability. For example, developing countries may not have sufficient adequate financial resources to combat climate change. They may not be having adequate mechanisms to combat climate change. On the other hand, developed countries may have financial resources, technological capacity, and other resources, other mechanisms to combat climate change compared to developing countries and small island states. So therefore, when you ask the developing countries to take up emission reduction, it is important that we have to take into consideration their capacity, their respective capability. So, based on these two principles, there were a lot of discussions. It was also pointed out, the polluter pays principle was also pointed out. Polluter pays principles means that those countries which have polluted the atmosphere, namely the developed countries, must pay for their emissions. It was also pointed out that in terms of the per capita emissions, developed countries are much ahead compared to developing countries. If we look at the statistics, it is very clear. In terms of, if I take the example of United States of America, the per capita carbon emissions from the US is 16.24 tons. When we talk about China, on the other hand, compared to the 16.24 tons per capita of the US, China's per capita emission is 6.98 tons. India's per capita emission is 1.84 tons. So definitely, in terms of the total emissions, in terms of the per capita emissions, developed countries have more responsibility to combat climate change compared to developing countries. Therefore, what I am saying that compared to developing countries, especially China and India, developed countries have more responsibility in terms of addressing climate change because their per capita emission is very high, their historical emission is very high. Therefore, it was decided that it is important that we have to have an international agreement wherein the developed countries take up more responsibility. So, Kyoto Protocol, which came up in 1997, divided countries into two categories: Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries. Annex 1 countries means developed countries, non-Annex 1 countries means mainly developing countries. And based on this categorization, Annex 1 countries, that is developed countries, were asked to take up binding emission reduction. On the other hand, the non-Annex 1 countries, that's developing countries, were asked to take up only voluntary emission reduction. Developed countries agreed to this proposal and majority of the developed countries signed the Kyoto Protocol, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which was the very first international climate change treaty. The United States, the largest historical contributor, was also part of the Kyoto Protocol. US under the then President Bill Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol. But the very signing of the US in the Kyoto Protocol had created a lot of issues in US domestic politics. Many in US domestic politics pointed out that being part of a binding agreement like the Kyoto Protocol would definitely result in the decline of the economic growth of United States. Therefore, it is better for the United States to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol. There were discussions within the Senate. In the Senate, a declaration, a statement was passed, a resolution was passed. This resolution is called the Bayard-Hagel resolution. The Bayard-Hagel resolution passed in the United States pointed out two things. United States is not going to be party to any protocol if it is exempting China and India. Second, United States would not be party to any agreement which affect its economic growth. So, pointing out the economic growth, how the Kyoto Protocol would affect the economic prospects of the US, pointing out that, and secondly, pointing out the exemption given to China and India from taking up binding emission reduction targets, United States decided to withdraw from Kyoto Protocol. This withdrawal process was complete in 2001 when George W. Bush was the President of United States of America. George W. Bush, he was skeptical about the science of climate change, and there were also speculations that number of oil companies had also played their role in influencing President Bush's decision to withdraw the US completely from Kyoto Protocol. Later on, the reports had come up stating that the Exxon Oil Mobil company, which had a major role in Bush administration and in pursuing the Bush administration to withdraw the US from the Kyoto Protocol. So, with the withdrawal of the United States from the Kyoto Protocol, what happened? Other countries also, other developed countries also started to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol. Following the US, New Zealand, Russia, Canada, all these countries withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. This definitely affected the prospects of the Kyoto Protocol, the very effectiveness of the Kyoto Protocol. Though the Kyoto Protocol came into effect in 2005, the very withdrawal of these major contributors, especially the United States, New Zealand, Russia, all these countries, Canada, all these countries affected the very implementation of the Kyoto Protocol. So, it was almost clear that the Kyoto Protocol cannot find a success in bringing down the overall emissions. This actually led to the discussions about another international agreement in order to ensure the compliance of all countries and thereby help in reducing the emissions. After 2000, by 2007, the Bali conference was held. In the Bali conference, again countries started to discuss about giving form to another international agreement. They talked about mitigation, they talked about adaptation to climate change, they talked about the financial mechanisms to combat climate change, so on and so forth. Finally, by 2010, a Green Climate Fund was given form. In the Green Climate Fund, the developed countries promised that they would be giving $100 billion to developing countries in order to enable them to combat climate change. Because developing countries are in short of financial resources, technological capacity in combating climate change. For example, if we talk about India, India is a very vulnerable country towards climate change. Sea level rise is happening, melting of the glaciers is a reality, many coastal areas are almost at the submergence level. So, how we would cope up with these climate effects? This is a serious issue which we all are facing. When we talk about Kerala, for that matter, there was a report that by 2050, Kochi would be underwater. And related to Manro Tirth, we are seeing the day-to-day happening. So, these things we are witnessing. When we talk about the monsoon these days, we know that, in within a few days we are getting rain in high intensity. So, it's the erratic climate patterns, the weather patterns, extreme drought, rainfall, all these we all are experiencing it in our day-to-day life. Therefore, the developing countries should have the financial mechanism, they should have the technological capacity. This was one of the important argument of developing countries. Developing countries argued for equity and fairness in climate change negotiations. Why they demanded for fairness in climate change negotiations? Because even when the Kyoto Protocol was framing, a lot of discussions were happening in the green room. Mainly the meetings were happening in the green rooms, and many small island countries, least developed countries, they argued that they were not getting adequate representation in the green room meetings. The decisions were taken by the developed countries themselves, and most of the time the voice of the least developed countries and small island states were not heard. So, this argument was also there. But on one thing, all the countries agreed that we have to have an international agreement, since Kyoto Protocol was almost ineffective by that time due to the withdrawal of, as I already mentioned, the other developed countries like US, Canada, New Zealand, so on and so forth. this discussion happened. One of the important argument that was pointed out was that this time it is not possible to have a binding emission reduction treaty. Instead of having a binding emission reduction treaty, it is better to have a voluntary emission reduction treaty. A voluntary emission reduction treaty would be better for all countries because this would help in the ratification of the treaty in their domestic politics. Therefore, countries agreed that we will give form to a voluntary emission reduction treaty. By that time, India and China were also not in a position to keep themselves away from committing to reduce their emissions. Why they were not in a position to committing to reduce emissions? Because by 2007, China had become the number one CO2 emitter, carbon emitter, pushing the United States to the second position. Till that time, if United States was the number one emitter, by 2007, China became the largest annual carbon dioxide emitter. India's position was also not that behind as of now in terms of the annual carbon dioxide emissions. India is in the 4th place. That means developing countries, due to their economic growth and all, definitely that will translate to more emissions. And our dependence on fossil fuel is very high. Due to our high dependence upon this fossil fuel energy, especially on coal and so on and so forth, our emissions were increasing year by year. So as of now, United States is the United States is in the second annual CO2 emitter. China stands in the 1st place. The 3rd place is EU, but definitely, as you know, EU is not a country, but it's a union of countries, and the 4th place is India holds the 4th place. So this is the statistics as of now. Therefore, when the discussions about the framing of the second international environmental treaty, climate change treaty started, all the countries, including India, developing countries including India and China, decided that they would also become part of a voluntary agreement. So the Paris Agreement was framed in 2015. After the Kyoto Protocol, this was one of the important success of the international climate change diplomacy. All the countries except 3 or 4 countries, all the world countries participated in the Paris Agreement. But one of the criticism that was pointed out against the Paris Agreement was this: the Paris Agreement was based on voluntary emission reduction commitments. On the other hand, when we talk about the Kyoto Protocol was based on the binding emission reduction commitments, but here the Paris Agreement was based on voluntary emission reduction commitment. Therefore, there was this confusion to what extent countries would remain really committed to the Paris Agreement goals. Though the critics raised this important argument, majority of the countries decided that it would be better for countries to have a voluntary emission reduction agreement in order to secure the ratification from their domestic institutions. Finally, the voluntary agreement was signed and countries submitted their nationally determined commitments. And the nationally determined commitments of the countries were varied because they were given the full freedom to decide on to which level they would be reducing their emissions. Therefore, the emission reduction pledges of countries were different. When we talk about India, the government of India pledged that it would be reducing its carbon emissions 33 to 35% from 2005 level by 2030. China promised that it would cut its carbon emissions intensity from 60 to 65% by 2030. US promised that it would be reducing its emissions 26 to 28% based on 2005 level by 2025. So all these countries gave different promises. As far as India is concerned, one of the important shift that we had from our traditional climate change policy was that we remained truly committed to to the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, many reports point out that we are already on the path to fulfill our Paris targets, but on the other hand, many other developed countries are deviating from their Paris goals. But India is really committed, India is focused, and most probably India would be achieving its Paris emission reduction targets. After the 2009, especially after the Copenhagen conference, we can see the shift in India's policy. We can, if earlier for India, poverty reduction and economic growth were the primary targets, now for us, along with economic growth, environment, especially the climate change issue, has become one of the important agenda in our foreign policy. Therefore, the ministry which has been formed in order to combat climate change and other institutions that are in place give adequate focus to combat climate change. In 2008 itself, we had given form to the National Action Plan on Climate Change. This National Action Plan on Climate Change has got a set of missions, and through these missions we are trying to reduce the level of emissions. And in the case of India, we have already signed a solar agreement alliance with, we have made an alliance with France. When United States, though United States, in the case of United States, it signed the Paris Agreement, but you have to keep one thing in mind, that the United States under President had withdrawn itself from the Paris Agreement. In a way, for the US, history was repeating. The US had signed the former Kyoto Protocol, but during the time of George W. Bush, it had withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol. Now, during the time of Obama, US President Obama, though the US had signed the Paris Agreement, it had withdrawn itself from the Paris Agreement under Trump. For the United States, it has shown this drastic shifts in terms of its climate change policy, but we have remained intact on our path. We have remained truly committed to the climate change agenda so far. In the recent elections that happened in the US, though under President Joe Biden, United States has re-entered the Paris Agreement, still it is the time is left for the US to prove itself that it would remain truly committed to the climate agenda. In April 2021, Joe Biden had hosted the Leaders Summit, in which India was also an important party, and US has already signed a bilateral agreement, climate change agreement with India. US has bilateral climate agreement with other countries as well. But even though we are having this climate agreements, bilateral and multilateral climate agreements, to what extent we would remain committed to the climate goals domestically is an important issue, because there are various domestic players in each and every country, and how these domestic players would be responding to the climate agenda, how our political parties would be responding to the climate agenda, how media would be responding to the climate agenda, how transnational corporations would be responding to the climate agenda, how non-governmental bodies would be responding to the climate agenda. Therefore, along with the state mechanisms, along with the state apparatus, it is important that we have to make sure the engagement of the non-state actors. The non-state actors have to be made an important, essential part in fostering our climate goals, because climate change is an issue which affects not one country, but this is an issue which is truly international in nature. This is a truly transnational challenge. It is no more a domestic challenge, it is no more a challenge which affects one single country, but this is an international issue. Therefore, the international cooperation, it has to be made possible whenever we are having dialogues about climate change issue. But at the same time, locally also we can take a number of initiatives. It is high time for each and every one of us to at least reduce our dependence upon fossil fuel energy and shift to renewable mechanisms. Renewable energy could be utilized in our day-to-day life. There are number of things that we can probably do in order to reduce our energy consumption. Because in a way, if we are doing it, we are also becoming the climate activists in one way or the other way. So what I wanted to tell you is that what we have to do is to have collective cooperation, collective effort in order to combat the climate crisis. This is not just the issue of one or two people, this is not just the issue of the political parties or not just the issue of one or two states, but this is an issue which affects the entire humanity. Therefore, it is important for each and every one of us to remain as responsible citizens who are truly committed to the climate goals. I hope in a post-COVID world we would be able to fulfill the targets that are set by the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement tells us that it is we have to strive to reduce the emissions below 1.5 degrees Celsius, but already we have already crossed the mark, but at least we should be able to restrict the global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, we would be facing the drastic effects of climate change. Already we are facing it in terms of health security, in terms of economic security, in terms of agricultural security. We are facing the consequences of climate change. Therefore, if we have to remain in this world, it is important that we have to truly remain committed to the environmental cause. Thank you very much.